The house felt wrong the morning after Laura Harper died. Not broken, just hollow, like the sound had been taken out of it. David Harper stood in the kitchen, holding a mug he had forgotten to fill, staring at the place where Laura used to sit, and read the paper. The chair was still there. Everything was still there. That was the worst part. Emily Harper arrived from Boston 2 days later. She drove straight through the night, her hands tight on the wheel, her thoughts moving faster. Then the road. She had spoken to her father on the phone, but he had sounded distant, polite, like a man answering a stranger. The porch light was on, but David wasn't outside waiting. He had never missed greeting her before. Inside, the house smelled like dust and old coffee. David stood in the hallway, thinner than she remembered, his shoulders bent forward as if the weight of the air was too much. He hugged her, but his arms didn't close all the way. Emily hugged him harder, feeling his breath shake against her shoulder. Neither of them cried. It felt like crying belonged to another life. The days after the funeral moved too quickly and too slowly at the same time. People came and went with food, flowers, and quiet words. Emily smiled and thanked them. David? When the house finally emptied, silence filled every corner. Emily stayed, telling her boss she needed time. No one argued. Mornings were the hardest. Laura had owned the mornings. She woke early, made coffee, talked about small things that somehow felt important. Now David woke late, sat at the table, and stared at nothing. Emily tried to help without pushing. She cooked, she cleaned. She spoke when needed and stayed quiet when words felt wrong. One afternoon, Emily found her father in the garage, holding Laura's old gardening gloves. He didn't notice her at first, his fingers pressed into the worn fabric like he was trying to remember her hands. Emily stepped back without a sound. She learned then that grief wasn't loud. It hid in small moments and struck without warning. A week later, there was a knock at the door. Emily answered it. A woman stood on the porch, tall, calm, with soft gray hair pulled back and a scarf wrapped loosely around her neck. Her eyes were kind but careful. "I'm Grace Miller," the woman said. "I was Laura's friend." From college, Emily stepped aside at once. Grace didn't rush in. She entered slowly, as if asking permission from the house itself. When David saw her, something in his face changed, not relief, not pain, but recognition. They stood facing each other for a moment, both unsure. "I heard," Grace said quietly. "I'm so sorry, David." He nodded. "Thank you for coming." Grace brought soup and bread. She set them on the counter without comment. She didn't fill the space with questions. She sat at the table and waited. Slowly, David spoke. About Laura's laugh. About how she hated cold weather but refused to move south. Grace listened like every word mattered. Emily watched from the doorway. She expected the sight to hurt, but it didn't. It felt steady. Grace wasn't trying to replace anything. She was simply present. After that day, Grace visited once or twice a week. Always during daylight. Always with something simpler meal. A book. A memory. She talked about her life in Vermont, her teaching job, her quiet routines. David listened more than he spoke, but Emily noticed something new. He looked up when Grace entered a room, shoulders eased. Once he even smiled. That smile stayed with Emily long after Grace left. Time moved forward whether David wanted it to or not. Leaves turned. The air grew sharper. Emily took walks alone, thinking about her mother, about how Laura had loved deeply but never feared change. Laura had believed that love was something you carried forward, not something you buried. One evening, David and Emily sat on the porch. The sky was darkening, the trees bare and honest. David hadn't spoken in a while. Emily waited. She had learned patience from her mother. "I don't know who I am without her," David said at last. Emily swallowed. "You're still you." He shook his head. "Everything I did was with her in mind." Emily looked at his hands, resting uselessly on his knees. Hands that had fixed things, held her when she was small. She felt a tightness in her chest, not just grief, but fear. Fear that her father would fade into the quiet forever. Grace's name crossed her mind, uninvited but clear. Emily didn't plan what she said next. The words rose on their own, carried by love and worry and a truth she couldn't ignore. And she whispered something that would stay with him long after the night grew cold. The porch light flickered on behind them. David turned to look at her, his eyes wide, his breath caught between guilt and hope. He didn't speak. Emily sat back, heart racing, unsure if she had crossed a line or opened a door that could never be closed again. The house behind them was still quiet, but something had shifted. And neither of them knew what would come next. David Harper did not sleep that night. Emily's whisper stayed in his mind, clear and heavy. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house breathe. For the first time since Laura died, the silence did not only hurt. It asked a question. The next morning, David woke early. The sun was barely up. He made coffee, real coffee, not the weak kind he had been drinking. He stood at the sink and watched steam rise. The motion felt strange, like using a muscle he had forgotten. Emily noticed. She said nothing, but her eyes followed him with quiet hope. David went for a walk later that day. He walked past familiar houses, past neighbors who waved carefully, unsure what version of him they would get. He walked until his legs burned. With every step, guilt fought with longing. He loved Laura. That love had not faded. But loneliness had been eating at him, slow and patient. Grace did not come for several days. David noticed the space she left behind. He caught himself listening for the sound of her car. When she finally returned, carrying a small box of old photos Laura had once given her, David felt a nervous flutter. That scared him. They sat at the table. The photos spread between them. Laura smiling. Laura young. Laura alive in ways David had forgotten. Grace spoke gently, never pushing. When David's voice broke, she waited. When he stopped, she did not rush to fill the space. "I feel like I'm doing something wrong," David said quietly. Grace met his eyes. "Feeling alive isn't wrong." The words settled deep. That evening, David told Emily about the photos. He did not mention how close Grace had sat or how warm the room had felt. Emily listened and nodded. She was learning that love meant stepping back as much as stepping in. Days turned into weeks. Winter came fully. Snow wrapped the town in white, forcing everything to slow down. Grace and David began meeting outside the house. Coffee at first, then walks through quiet streets. Kay spoke about loss, about age, about fear. They did not touch. Kay, the space between them was careful but charged. One night, David admitted what he had been holding back. "I'm afraid people will think I'm replacing her." Grace shook her head. Anyone who knew Laura would know better. That night, David dreamed of Laura. She was not sick. She was not sad. She was standing in the garden, smiling in that knowing way she had. When he woke, his pillow was wet, but his chest felt lighter. Emily noticed the change more clearly now. Her father stood straighter. He shaved, he hummed while cooking. It hurt and healed her at the same time. She missed her mother fiercely, but she did not want her father to disappear into grief. One afternoon, Emily ran into Grace at the grocery store. They stood awkwardly at first, then Grace spoke. "You're very brave," Grace said. Emily frowned. "I didn't do anything." Grace smiled softly. "You gave him permission to live." Emily went home and cried for the first time since the funeral. The first real test came on Laura's birthday. David almost canceled plans with Grace. He stood in the hallway, coat in hand, shaking. Emily saw him and walked over. "You don't have to go," she said. "I want to," he replied. "That's what scares me." Emily hugged him. "Mom loved you. She wouldn't want you stuck." David left. At the small restaurant, David and Grace talked for hours. They laughed, then fell quiet, then laughed again. When David reached for Grace's hand, it happened without thought. She did not pull away. The touch was gentle, respectful, but it sent a rush through him that made his eyes fill. "I don't want to rush this," Grace said. "Neither do I," David answered. But something had already crossed a line, and neither of them wanted to go back. The town noticed, whispers followed them, some kind, some sharp. David felt the looks, but they no longer stopped him. For the first time since Laura's death, he felt like a man, not just a widower. Emily struggled more than she expected. Seeing her father with another woman stirred a strange mix of relief and pain. One night, she dreamed her mother was calling her from another room and she could not reach her. She woke up shaking. Emily and Grace finally spoke alone. They sat in the living room, the same place Laura used to sit. "I'm not trying to take her place," Grace said. "I know," Emily replied. "I just need time." Grace nodded. "So do I." Spring arrived quietly. Flowers pushed through frozen ground. David worked in the yard again. Grace helped. Emily watched them from the window, feeling something inside her settle. Then life reminded them it never moves in straight lines. David's health faltered one morning. Chest pain, dizziness. Emily rushed him to the hospital. Grace arrived soon. After, pale with fear. They waited together, hours stretching thin. When the doctor finally spoke, the news was not fatal. But it was serious enough to wake them all. Stress had taken its toll. Later, alone in the room, David looked at Emily and Grace standing side by side. In that moment, he understood something. Clear and sharp. Love had not left him when Laura died. It had changed shape. It had multiplied. "I don't want to waste what time I have," David said. Grace's eyes filled. Emily nodded through tears. Recovery forced David to slow down, but it also forced honesty. He asked Grace to move forward with him carefully, openly. She agreed. Months passed. Emily prepared to return to Boston. On her last night, the three of them ate dinner together. The house felt full again, not the same, but alive. After Emily left, David and Grace stood in the doorway watching her car disappear. "Are we doing the right thing?" David asked. Grace took his hand. "I think we're doing the honest thing." The house was quiet again, but not hollow. And somewhere beyond grief, beyond fear, David Harper finally allowed himself to believe that love could begin again, not by forgetting the past, but by carrying it forward.